All right, I think I'm just going to start off. First of all, welcome everybody. This is the second of 3 primers for the YCI annual conference. This conference is going to take place on April 9th at the law school here at Yale. All the information can be found here. And if you haven't yet, please register. Today's conference primer is going to address the topic of the conference, technological innovation for an energy secure future. And we're going to have 3 PhD experts from Yale to speak on batteries, solar fuels, and genomics, and giving you a short introduction to each of these topics. The speakers are Carl Bibby from Environmental Engineering. He's a 3rd year in Jordan Patch's lab. We have Forrest Gibbelson. He is a 2nd year in Andrea Taylor's lab, and he's in chemical engineering. And then the 3rd person speaking is going to be James Blakemore. He's a 4th year student in chemistry. And the way it's going to work is that each of them is going to give you a 10-15 minute introduction to the topic. And afterwards, they're going to sit down and discuss the feasibility of the technology and the future of the technologies together with Gary Moore, who is also a postdoc in Gary Berdwick's lab.
So thanks for coming out this evening. I'm Forrest Gibbelson from Andrea Taylor's lab just across the street. So if you're interested more in what I say and in the discussion, please come and talk to us over there. But my goal today is just to introduce you to battery technology, specifically rechargeable battery technology, and recent developments in the past few years. So why really do we need to be interested in energy storage? Well, if you look at many of the main energy sources or just energy sources that are being considered for the future, you'll notice that several of the greenest ones have the problem of only producing energy intermittently. For instance, PV solar cells or wind. For other sorts of energy sources like combustion and, say, a fuel cell for the future, these really don't have a problem with portability, but PV solar cells, yeah, there's a problem with portability, and also for wind. So for these reasons, we really need energy storage, and probably the, if not the easiest way, definitely the most popular way of storing energy is a battery. So you may recognize that there's some new cars coming out, for instance, the Chevy Volt, which use these sorts of new batteries, specifically lithium ion. And then there's also Tesla Roadsters. So these are actually quite applicable to technology that's coming out recently and in the very near future. So before we continue, I think it's important to just summarize several metrics of battery evaluation. And the most important is definitely energy and gravimetric energy, volumetric energy. That's when you normalize by, say, the weight of the battery or by the volume of the battery. And capacity is directly related to energy, so I'll be talking about that. Also important is the power that you get out of the battery. For certain applications, you want high power. For some, you want only like a trickle current. Durability is also important. For, say, your portable devices, you don't want them to last only a couple of months. You want to let them to last like several years. Preferably for like laptops, you don't have to buy a new one every year. That would be great. Also, safety, you don't want your batteries to explode like some Sony batteries did on airplanes. That's not a good idea. Also, you want to be able to recycle or at least dispose of some of these battery materials in a green, clean way. So here's some just general types of secondary batteries. I'm just going to be talking about secondary batteries because this is where most of the recent work is being done. You'll recall that lead acid, that's the typical battery that's used in your car. It's very large, bulky, doesn't have a great power density or energy density. Then nickel cadmium and nickel metal hydride were kind of mainly used in the 90s for portable devices like cameras. Those are now, if not obsolete, getting there. And then there's lithium ion, which is the state of the art at the moment. And the reason that is the case is seen on the graph on the right. If I had a pointer, which I don't, can you see this? Okay, so this area is lithium ion. And that really also contains lithium polymer and what is denoted as lithium phosphate, I guess. Yeah. Oh, great. Perfect. Okay, so this area, that's lithium polymer. So you can see that the energy density is much better. Both gravimetric energy density on this axis and volumetric energy density on that axis, meaning that lithium-ion batteries are both lighter and smaller than competing technologies. They also operate at higher voltages, which is good for some applications that require that. They also have very low rate of self-discharge and essentially have no memory effect. So you can charge them to whatever, I don't know, 50% and then discharge, and there's no effect on the capacity afterwards. So it's important to just realize how lithium-ion batteries work. So a basic lithium-ion battery is one that is composed of a cathode and an anode with an electrolyte in the middle. You can see there's a separator because you want to make sure that the anode and cathode don't touch because that would be a short circuit. So you have to have some sort of separator, but the electrolyte enables ions, in this case lithium ions, to pass back and forth. So in the charge mechanism, what you have is the application of a voltage which causes lithium ions to transfer from the cathode material. A standard cathode material is lithium cobalt oxide. Also here's the reaction for the cathode. And with this application of the voltage, electrons go around the circuit to the anode, and lithium ions move across the electrolyte to the anode and bind there. And this is the anode reaction. For the discharge mechanism, you essentially just have the reverse. Lithium ions go back across, electrons go back around, and that is where you get your powering of your device. So, as I said, lithium cobalt oxide is the standard cathode material at the moment, and that's because it has a pretty decent capacity, which is measured in this case, in milliamp hours per gram of 160. The difficulty or the problem with this material is that using cobalt is, well, let's just say it's not renewable because there's a limited amount of cobalt. And it's actually kind of expensive. So we want to transition to something that's cheaper and there's more of. So that's where these materials come in. These are different types of crystals. Lithium manganese oxide and lithium iron phosphate. So lithium manganese oxide was the first one of these cathode materials to be developed as an alternative to lithium cobalt oxide. But you can see that it has a lower theoretical capacity than the cobalt oxide material. The reason why it's used is because it's less expensive, which I guess makes sense. And then there's lithium iron phosphate, which is even more new than that, which has a superior capacity, but suffers from problems of poor electrical conductivity. which have been addressed by coating some of those small particles of that crystal with carbon or doping with other sorts of transition metals. That's where this lithium blends comes in. These are the types of metals that might be used to dope these crystals and improve conductivity, electrical conductivity, and durability. And then there's also vanadium pentoxide, which is even newer than that and not something that's actually been considered too much so far. So it's really more of an up-and-coming material for cathode. And the problems with that, of course, which need to be addressed, are poor electrical and ion conductivity. But you can see that the capacity is superior, so it's something to be looked into. On the anode side, graphite is the standard material, and that's because it is inexpensive and it's light. So it has a pretty decent capacity. And you'll notice that this number is actually larger than for the cathode material. So that means that the cathode is the limiting factor, really, in all of these batteries. But it's important to improve the anode also because you want to decrease the overall weight of the battery. So that's where these new materials come in. As an alternative to graphite, there are carbon nanotubes, single-wall and multi-wall nanotubes. Some of them, in some cases, because of the stoichiometry, these offer better capacities, but are definitely more expensive. So that's something to be addressed. And maybe that means that it doesn't, these are not of great use in, say, a commercial battery, but they're interesting for research purposes anyway. Then there's also lithium alloying materials like tin and germanium, which have better capacities, but suffer from problems mainly upon lithium intercalation, that is diffusing of the lithium ions into these materials. When you charge, these materials tend to swell, and also for this silicon. And when they swell, they actually increase in volume about 300%. And then when you take the lithium ions out, they shrink and crack, as in this picture. And that leads to a decrease in electrical conductivity, which is something that really has to be addressed. So these materials offer great promise, but specifically, the silicon nanowires are probably the state-of-the-art in anode materials now because they address this cracking feature because when the increase in volume occurs with lithium intercalation, which you see in this picture, that expansion is actually kind of contained in the axial direction or in the radial direction. There is a transition from, this morphology down here to the amorphous morphology. But for the most part, it's a pretty durable material. And silicon is light and relatively inexpensive. So, and it has very good capacity. So that's definitely something that's being considered and is actually, potentially will be used in GM cars in the future. And then there's the electrolyte, which is probably one of the biggest challenges. A standard electrolyte is a liquid electrolyte in most of the batteries that you will see in portable devices, for instance. And that's essentially just lithium salt dissolved in an organic solvent. And because it's liquid, the lithium ions transfer pretty easily, has very good ion conductivity for that reason. But over the cycling, there's a lot of degradation. That is, the organic solvent becomes, or forms crystals, which then can cause a short circuit or destroy the electrodes on both sides. So that's something that has been taken care of in the typical lithium cobalt oxide cell with graphite, but is something that really hasn't been considered in some of these new materials. As an alternative to a liquid electrolyte, you also have a polymer electrolyte, which could be a gel, which is essentially polymer and liquid electrolyte together mixed, which also acts as a separator, so you don't need a porous separator between your electrodes. So these types of cells are generally thinner because you can coat that polymer electrolyte and separator pretty thinly, and that leads to flexible cells, which is good. It's also lightweight because it doesn't require extensive or very heavy metal packaging, as in other sorts of cells with liquid electrolytes, for instance. It's also better because you don't have the sorts of electrolyte degradation that you do with a liquid electrolyte, but there's also increased internal resistance, which is something that can be improved, I don't know, either by heating, for instance, because polymers usually, or at least the polymers being used in these circumstances, usually improve in ion conductivity when you heat them, or by just developing new polymers that are more ionically conductive. And then also, for a different sort of electrolyte, there's glass ceramic electrolytes, which definitely require high temperature operation in order to achieve the ion conductivity that is typical for, well, at least anywhere near typical for a liquid electrolyte. But you do solve that problem. There's really no electrolyte degradation, but there's a bit of a problem with getting good contact between, say, a solid material and the solid electrode also. So lithium sulfur is a bit of a new technology. It's actually not new. It was introduced back, or at least hypothesized back in the 70s, but nobody really did anything with it until recently. And I'll explain to you why, but the reason why this is kind of an interesting new, perhaps next generation lithium battery is because the stoichiometry is pretty good. You may have seen, I didn't actually point it out, but in some of the previous slides, I did show some stoichiometries which have Li, for example, C6, so that's 1 lithium ion for every 6 carbons. In this case, you have 2 lithiums for every 1 sulfur. So this is a favorable stoichiometry and leads to a much better theoretical capacity in any case. Sulfur is also relatively inexpensive, so that's a benefit also. The difficulties in dealing with this sort of technology are mainly with degradation, but also since sulfur is not electrically conductive, you have to deal with that by mixing it with, say, some carbon or in a carbon matrix in order to make it conductive so that ions can flow away from the cathode material. The degradation for this sort of material occurs in the intermediates which form between the most lithiated compound and just the sulfur. So these materials actually dissolve in organic electrolyte, which means that you have a large loss of material or active material over time, which is something that has to be addressed. And this graph is just one example. The paper that this is from used a polymer electrolyte in order to reduce the amount of organic, liquid organic electrolyte in order to control this. And if you compare to some of those theoretical capacities before, they were down here for standard materials, and now it's up here, so that's a good improvement. And then you may have also heard about lithium air, or more specifically, lithium oxygen cells, which are quite similar to fuel cells in that you don't have the whole thing is not enclosed, so it's a flow sort of system, which involves lithium on one side as the anode, electrolyte in the middle, and a porous cathode on the other side, which is usually carbon plus some sort of catalyst. So what actually happens is during discharge, you have lithium ions coming from the anode going across the electrolyte and combining with oxygen, which flows through to form lithium oxides. The difficulty, or the reason why this sort of architecture has only been considered recently, is because up until 2009, nobody was really sure that you could reverse these reactions. So now that you know, you can, at least with certain catalysts like gold and platinum. Those are, of course, expensive, but the benefit to this is in weight and, again, favorable stoichiometry. So from this graph, you can see this has all of the previous rechargeable batteries that I mentioned, along with lithium ion, lithium sulfur. The yellow represents theoretical capacities, so don't really pay much attention to those, but at least the blues, at least for the blues, you can see that there's quite an improvement over lithium ion in energy density with lithium air, and it even rivals gasoline, which is something good. So I mentioned all the good things about lithium air or lithium oxygen, and now these are all the problems that we need to solve. So we need to improve catalysts in order to improve the round-trip efficiency. So this graph up here kind of gives you an indication of what we're aiming for. Just the plain old carbon, you can see, has a difference or an overpotential that's pretty large between 2.5 volts and 4.5 volts. When you add this novel catalyst, you reduce the overpotential, and that improves the round-trip efficiency. But the best that has been able to be achieved with these catalysts so far is only 60 to 70%, versus for lithium ion it's about 95%. So that's something that has to be addressed. Also, in designing these sorts of cells, you have to make sure that there's a pretty good airflow or oxygen flow to the cathode. And you have to balance the porosity of that cathode versus the ion conductivity, which is from all of your ion conducting polymers that are in there also. And then you have to solve the problem of electrolyte and membranes. What do you choose? Well, that's a big question. For membranes, you certainly need something to block H2O, because you can't have that reacting with lithium. That would be a safety hazard. And beyond that, how are you going to package this? These are all things that haven't really been discussed so far in the literature. And I just wanted to leave you with an idea of the research time frame in some of these technologies that I've been talking about. Back in 1991 was when the first rechargeable lithium-ion cell was produced by Sony. And you can see in this graph, this is a graph of publications over time. Essentially, there were no publications on lithium-ion at that point in time. But soon after that, there was a large increase. And that corresponds with an increase in commercial potential also for those sorts of cells. For lithium sulfur and lithium air, we're down here, which means we're really nowhere near actual commercial potential of these. And I think probably for at least those two technologies, it's at least 15 years out is what we're talking about. So thank you.
So I'm Kyle. I work in Jordan Pecha's lab in environmental engineering with Nina, actually, who introduced everybody. And she asked me to give a talk today about genomics and bioenergy, which is a huge topic area. So I decided to whittle it down a little bit and talk about something I know a little bit better, a subset of that, which is next generation DNA sequencing, and apply that to bioenergy. So the biological production of energy, or bioenergy, has enormous potential to replace fossil fuels and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, which, because you're here, I'm assuming you care about. But we need to figure out how to make the biology work for us. By that I mean nature has taken 1 billion+ years to evolve and be really good at producing energy for a cell's use within the cell. But it hasn't ever cared about producing energy for us. So we need to trick these cells or trick these systems or design systems to use this biology and produce energies for us. So some examples you might have heard of are anaerobic digestion, very common, microalgae for fuel production, or biofuel grass like switchgrass, or even corn ethanol. So knowledge of the fundamental biology in these systems is essential and critical. We need to know what's going on to design these systems and maximize the energy output. So some really fundamental questions we might ask is who's there? If it's a mixed community system and there's different types of organisms or microorganisms present, we need to understand this ecology, this community composition, and who is doing what. And then in all the systems, even for switchgrass or any type of bioenergy system, we need to understand what are these organisms doing and how are they doing that. To understand that, we need to know the genes and gene pathways. So there's multiple ways we could go about trying to figure out these fundamental biology questions. One of those possible ways is by using nucleic acid sequencing or DNA sequencing. So just really quickly, I don't know everybody's background in the room, but when I talk about a nucleic acid or DNA sequence, each one of us has DNA, all organisms have DNA, and they're comprised of 4 nucleic acids. And when I talk about the sequence, that's just the text we use to represent this sequence. So once we get this sequence, we can use bioinformatics and other tools to classify and characterize this sequence and hopefully answer some of those questions I was asking on the previous slide. And we're also lucky to be able to use DNA to do this because it's very unique and specific to genes and functions. So DNA sequencing has been around for decades in some form. It's traditionally been called Sanger sequencing. But in 2005, what we call next generation DNA sequencing emerged. And this is really the enabling technology here. On this graph, I have both the speed and cost of DNA sequencing graphed. Cost is on the dashed line, and that's on the left axis there. These are log axes. And speed is on the solid line and on the right axis. You could see it's gone down. Cost has gone down significantly, and speed has gone up significantly in the last 5 years, and it continues to do so. So this means we're able to produce lots and lots and lots of sequence data. So this is great. For centuries, biology was limited by the amount of data it could produce. But right now we're in the middle of what is commonly called the data deluge. Right now we have more data because of these technologies than we even know what to do with. It's great because it allows us to produce biological insights that we wouldn't be able to produce otherwise. But we need rapidly evolving bioinformatics, and we need really powerful computational tools to make sense from this sequence. So just as a little bit of background, if people talk about genomics at the YCI conference, some next generation sequencing companies or platforms. The second generation, which is in use right now, is called 454 or Illumina. Those are really popular. And emerging right now is called the third generation, which is even more sequences at less cost. And those are produced by companies called PacBio or IonTorrent. This is just a brief example. Okay, so what specifically can these technologies tell us? So when we talk about genomics, I generally think of genome sequencing, and this is taking an organism's DNA and sequencing all of it. And this tells us the genetic potential of an organism. We can tell what genes it has and what it could potentially do with those genes and the pathways it can act. There's also metagenomics, which is if you have a mixed community or a community of different types of organisms, you sequence all of their DNA and see collectively what can they do and what genes do they have. This also tells you the community composition, or gets at the question, who is there? And last of all, transcriptomics. You sequence the RNA of an organism, and that shows you the genes that are actually transcribed and then more likely expressed. So what does this mean for bioenergy? This is just a little bit of background on next generation sequencing and genomics. It means that we can discover genes and gene pathways much more easily and rapidly than we could even a few years ago. And we could rapidly characterize these complex systems. This is great because it tells us how we need to operate these bioenergy systems to maximize the bioenergy output. And it also lets us explore additional crazy out there ideas really quickly and cheaply. And maybe one of them will be the gold mine. And another idea that is enabled by this is bioprospecting, which is we take unknown organisms and we sequence their DNA and see what genes and pathways they express that maybe we could utilize or genetically engineer into another organism. So that's just the background on genomics. Right now I'm going to get into a little bit of work that our lab does on microalgae and biofuel production as a kind of a case study for what we actually do with this technology. So you might have heard of microalgae biofuels before, but they accumulate high level of starches and lipids, which we can then use to produce biodiesel or ethanol. Algae are advantageous because they require less land space than other biofuel crops, and they also don't compete with food crops. So because of that, there's been a lot of recent interest in this technology. Unfortunately, there's only 2 microalgae, lipid-accumulating microalgae with their complete genomes sequenced, and this is really limiting. Also, sequencing their complete genome is still difficult and time-consuming. So our lab decided we're only interested in the genes that these microalgae express. So we're going to sequence what's known as the transcriptome, or the mRNA of this microorganism. And this gives us more functional information and tells us genes that are actually expressed much more quickly and rapidly than genome sequencing. So this was really successful. So some pathways that we care about because of fuel production and, for example, fatty acid biosynthesis or tag biosynthesis, we found almost all of the enzymes that are known to exist. And those that weren't found are likely because they don't have a known homolog in the database. So we're also limited by sequence information, and as we continue to sequence and do this more and more, we'll be more and more successful at identifying enzymes and identifying genes and gene pathways. So just as an example pathway, to show you what we can uncover just from this string of 4 letters, this is the fatty acid biosynthesis pathway that we uncovered, and we were successful at uncovering all the enzymes here and see how it functions. We're also using this information can see what level these genes are expressed, and see under different conditions, are genes expressed differently? Can we engineer systems to produce more fatty acids for use in biodiesel production? If you're interested in this, the paper was just published last week in BMC Genomics. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and also thank Hamid and Bharat, who work on algae, and Danina for planning this, and my advisor, Jordan. Thanks.
I'm, as Nina said, I'm James Blakemore, and I'm from the chemistry department. And I'll be talking to you about solar fuels, which is a very flashy name, I think. And so hopefully I can provide some info to go with that flashy name. So I'll be talking to you today about solar fuels. And I think before I start my actual presentation, I would just mention where solar fuels fits into sort of the overall picture of alternative energy. So the way I think about it is that currently a dominant fraction of the global energy demand is being met by unsustainable carbon-based so-called fossil fuels. And if you look at the transportation sector in particular, you'll note that an even higher proportion of the total fuel that drives transportation is carbon-based. And of course it's great, you know, you put some reduced carbon like gasoline into your car, and as you drive you can emit a colorless gas, carbon dioxide. So your vehicle gets lighter, and you know, it's very easy to just go and fill up again with more of that colorless liquid. But the premise of solar fuels is to utilize energy from the sun, which is arguably our best renewable, sustainable resource for energy, for either the direct or indirect production of fuel, like gasoline or hydrogen. Today I'll talk a lot about hydrogen. And we want to produce fuel rather than electricity or heat, precisely because it will be very useful for transportation, for being transported. But in general, the science of producing solar fuels presents serious challenges to chemists, chemical engineers, and companies who are working to demonstrate and better understand just the basic science and the basic processes that will be necessary for accomplishing the chemistry. But it's really a great opportunity and a wonderful challenge as a chemist to be confronted with all these problems. And hopefully in my presentation I'll be able to show you the background and then also some of the things that we're doing here at Yale in our group. So just as Kyle talked about biology, we also are looking to nature, not as directly as the bioenergy people, but more for inspiration. And in many ways, natural photosynthetic machinery in plants and bacteria provides a blueprint for methods to successfully capture, convert, and store solar energy. Oxygen is all around us, and it has been being produced by plants, green plants, and cyanobacteria and other organisms for about 2,400 million years on the planet. So, as Kyle said, all these machinery are very well tuned to transduce energy from sunlight and to fix carbon from the air. And of course, it's the carbon that plants fix in fossil fuels that we're now burning over those 2,400 years. But plants assemble elaborate photosystems which capture solar energy and use that energy to take electrons from their environment, from water, and to reduce carbon dioxide to fuel. And they do it in, as I said, in a very efficient manner. So I'll try not to rely on too many equations as a chemist, but plants take 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters, and they add in some light, and then we would get sugar out, as I've written here, and oxygen. If we want to break down that process into its simplest components, then on the oxidation side, plants are taking water, like we drink, and with light, they pull electrons out of water to release oxygen and protons. Those electrons and protons are then used by other pieces of cellular machinery to reduce carbon dioxide to a reduced form of carbon, and that reduced carbon is fuel. And the chemistry of the water oxidation side in particular is very specific, and it's only been accomplished by plants using one enzymatic system, one oxygen evolving complex. And so all of the plants, from the Sleeping Giant State Park to the mountains of Switzerland to the wheat fields of Kansas, all the electrons that those plants are using to fix carbon dioxide is coming through one molecular catalyst, one manganese complex, labeled OEC here. So how are plants doing this? There is a light-absorbing cofactor labeled P680, which absorbs light from the sun, visible light, and chemical events cause electrons to be passed out of that cofactor, and the electrons, to replace those ones that are being kicked out by the light, come from water. And 4 electrons and 4 protons are pulled out of water, and oxygen is released. So plants are using light to drive these key endothermic reactions, which means that they're energy demanding. They don't happen spontaneously. And as is written here, the first of these reactions occurs in an enzyme called photosystem 2, which oxidizes water to dioxygen, which is amazing for many reasons, one of which is that water is one of the most difficult to oxidize substances. And in fact, the entire protein framework that surrounds all of these cofactors is easier to oxidize in an absolute sense than water. But the chemistry is tuned exactly at that oxygen evolving complex, which, as you may have noticed, is what one of my lab's research directions is. That its center is tuned to oxidize water exactly. Plants do this rapidly, approximately 40 per second. 40 oxygens are produced per second. The plants do this with very little wasted energy. They're very efficient at harnessing that solar light to do the chemistry. And then importantly, and something you may read a lot about in the solar fuels literature, is that plants accomplish this with abundant and what we would call cheap materials. So things like the noble metals, platinum, iridium, are not used by plants. It's manganese, which we've already heard is cheap and widely available. So just to clarify again, the light-driven water oxidation is great, and it's the ultimate source of the electrons and protons used for these other biological processes. And it's those protons and electrons that are used to produce NADPH, which then is fed into the Calvin-Benson cycle for reducing carbon dioxide to sugars and lipids and things like that. So all these reactions are very difficult to accomplish. It's taken plants billions of years to tune them. And so chemists are faced with this very large challenge of mimicking these difficult reactions in simple artificial synthetic model systems. So how can we do the chemistry of water oxidation or CO2 reduction in a test tube? The chemical steps of all of these reactions have kinetic barriers. So not to get too technical, but every process has some thermodynamic minimum of energy that's required to accomplish it. And then there's some additional energy which comes from reorganizing the matter to accomplish that reaction. And to lower those kinetic barriers, those reorganization energy barriers, we need better catalysts for the reactions that we're trying to drive with light. And unfortunately, the way it is that the thermodynamics of these reactions are set. It will always take energy to split water into oxygen and protons, and it will always take some energy, however little, to turn protons or protons and CO2 into some sort of a reduced fuel. But we can organize things in such a way to minimize the kinetic barriers and produce fuel efficiently. So we can think of many approaches for doing solar energy conversion in plants. We have CO2 going to sugars, using electrons that come from water going to oxygen. And if we want to mimic that sort of chemistry, there are many, many different types of ways we can mimic it. Photovoltaic devices absorb energy and do charge separation, which gives you electrons traveling in a loop around a circuit where the light energy that excites those electrons is used then to accomplish electrical work. But we can also think about building electrochemical or photoelectrochemical devices, which is the center column, which is semiconductor liquid junction cells. And so in a cell like this, you may be familiar in high school, you may have taken a battery, put wires on the two leads, put it into water, and seen bubbles coming out from both sides. Oxygen on one, hydrogen on the other. So that is, in a nutshell, what I think of solar fuels as a paradigm, in that we're going to provide some energy to a beaker of water, essentially, and we'll get oxygen out as a side product, and then hydrogen that will harness, or hydrogen equivalent as fuel, which is essentially what's shown in the middle. In one scheme for artificial photosynthesis to give solar fuels, light energy is directly coupled to the chemistry of producing fuel, so that we would essentially shine light on a device, and from that device we would get transportation fuel, something that we could bottle, put in our car, drive away. So let's see. So if we burn hydrogen, all we're going to get back out is water, so it's a closed loop, carbon neutral. If we pull CO2 from the air and reduce that and then burn it, once again, there's no net CO2 release. So we're no longer pulling carbon out of the ground and burning it. We're just doing some sort of cyclic carbon neutral process. So there are, that's sort of the main background, and now I will share some vignettes of the community, I guess. So this is one slide. So you'll notice my last slide came from Nate Lewis, who is one of the guests that will be coming to the actual annual conference in a few weeks. And he's heading a large initiative that I'll tell you about in a few minutes. But this slide comes from the National Renewable Energy Lab and John Turner. And essentially what this slide says is that there are many sustainable paths to hydrogen. You can do some sort of a thermal process where water is heated with a special material giving hydrogen. From the heat of solar energy, you can get mechanical energy in the form of wind or waves to get electricity, and then do a basic water electrolysis process to get hydrogen. You can do a biomass process where plants harvest light, fix carbon, and then through some sort of conversion process can give hydrogen. And then also photolysis routes where the light absorption is directly coupled to production of fuel. So just to reiterate, an electrolyzer, which we'll see more of in a minute, a water electrolyzer is an energy conversion device which converts electrical or photo energy directly into chemical energy in the form of chemical bonds. Bonds are in your fuel in your car, so you burn the fuel, get CO2 out, whatnot. But essentially here is your high school electrolysis experiment where you've put energy into a beaker of water, and on one side you produce hydrogen and on the other oxygen. But as you can imagine, refining that process to minimize the kinetic barriers that I mentioned before is quite a complex and demanding game. So in this cell, there's one side where we take water to oxygen, and then protons move across either a membrane or a diaphragm that was listed here, or just across your beaker of water, and you get hydrogen out. And it's an endothermic reaction. And as I've drawn it here, we're applying an electrical voltage, which convert the water into hydrogen. But in a direct approach, the blue material, which is unlabeled here, would be both a catalyst for water oxidation and also a light absorbing unit, which directly transfers light energy to a catalyst to drive fuel production. So here at Yale, as I mentioned, I work in the chemistry department. I personally have two advisors, both of whom are listed here, Gary Brudvig and Bob Crabtree. But at Yale, there is a green energy consortium, as we call it, in which 4 chemistry PIs work to use solar light for fuel production. We have Victor Batista, one of whom is students I see here, who's a computational chemist, so we use modeling approaches to study the reactions that we wish to carry out in a computer before we build them or after. Gary Brudvig has a background in studying the natural system for photosynthesis and also in modeling that chemistry with artificial catalysts. Bob Crabtree is an inorganic chemist who also studies catalysis. And then finally, Charlie Schmuttenmeyer is a ultra-fast spectroscopist who uses the interaction of matter with light to get important information about these chemistry. As a chemist, what we do is we look at, I personally, just a vignette of my work, is to look at catalysts which accomplish the transformation of converting water to oxygen with a low barrier. You'll notice that I personally use iridium, which is not an abundant material, but we're learning a lot about the chemistry. This is another catalyst. So this is another piece of the puzzle that we'll see at the annual conference. In the solar fuels section, one of the industrial panelists is Rob Friedlander, who's the CEO of a company called Proton Energy Systems. Proton Energy Systems is actually a Connecticut company just up the road in Wallingford, which manufactures some of the, what I would consider the world's best water electrolyzers. And so in this movie, which I took, water is going into the cell through the white port on the back. And the white port on the front is water then carrying away oxygen that's the product of water electrolysis. And the tube on the top, which is going up, that is hydrogen gas that's produced. So the reaction that's written on the bottom is what you're seeing. As part of the Student Congress's recent mini conference or symposium, the VP of Research of Proton Energy Systems came and gave a talk all about their technology. And one of the pieces that she mentioned is that right now there really is no market or no feasible market for using their devices to produce fuel in a cost-competitive fashion, either with electricity from coal or electricity from solar panels. So one thing to watch out for would be to hear Rob Friedlander's feelings about the prospects for their type of water electrolysis, which is proton exchange membrane water electrolysis for fuel production, and also how it may fit into the whole grander solar fuels vision. Another piece is the so-called Solar Fuels Hub, which is based in, or will be based in California. It's more formally called, or will be called, the Joint Center for Artificial Photosynthesis. And Nate Lewis, another guest of the annual conference Solar Fuels section, who's giving the keynote, I believe, or a keynote, is the head of JCAP. And he'll, I'm sure, share lots of details about their proposed work. But from their website, I was just looking at it today, the mission of JCAP is to demonstrate a scalable and cost-effective solar fuels generator that, without the use of rare materials or wires, robustly produces fuel from the sun 10 times more efficiently than typical current crops. So imagine that in the multi-year time frame of their institute, they will produce a box which, when rolled out into sunlight, will produce hydrogen or reduced carbon. It's incredible. But today I can tell you the technology isn't there. Another final piece, and something that we're affiliated with here at Yale, is across the nation there are many are several what are so-called energy frontier research centers, which are funded by the Department of Energy, as is JCAP. This is the one that I'm most familiar with because this is the center that I work for. But they aim to do all of the things that I've just described for you: efficient catalysis, light absorption, and coupling all of these myriad processes together to efficiently convert abundant materials into fuel. And just to close, I thought I would show one thing that just came out in the literature this week from this institute. So this is an article from the Journal of the American Chemical Society. The reference is on the materials that I turned into the planners. But the title is Biomimetic Multifunctional Porous Chalcogels as Solar Fuel Catalysts, which is very exciting and scientific. But essentially, to boil it down for non-experts, essentially these researchers have prepared a membrane of sorts, which is stable under the desired conditions, and when light is shown on the membrane under certain conditions, which are carefully chosen to demonstrate the technology, this membrane produces hydrogen. So this is, in one area where we are today, the interface of nanotechnology and chemistry and engineering. And of course, I'm sure all of you and I are looking forward to the annual conference where we'll hear more of the details of these individual approaches to solving this very difficult problem. So thank you.
So we'll have the panelists sit down at the table, and Gary Moore will help ask informed questions, and then lead it to the audience as well.
All right, well, let's start with a warm welcome for our speakers today. We had the opportunity to hear 3 talks of what is essentially Yale's response to the coming energy crisis, or what's been called the energy challenge, or by some the terawatt challenge, and it really addresses the scale of this issue. Currently, as a planet, we operate at a burn rate of 30 terawatts. So that's energy per unit time. You don't have to worry about per year or per day. And that number is predicted to move from this current 15 terawatts to 30 terawatts by coming 2050. And so this is a serious issue of how do we meet this demand for global human energy consumption. As we heard from some of our speakers today, solar provides a resource that's abundant at 120,000 terawatts, but it's rather diffuse and intermittent. And I think one of the things that came through in the talks we heard today is the issue of storage. How do we store energy? And so we heard talks about battery technologies and advancements in air lithium. And we also heard about the approach of using nature's technique of storing energy in fuels, whether that be by artificial photosynthesis or manipulation of existing organisms. So we'll take questions at this point, but as the moderator, I have the privilege of being able to ask the first question. And so I'll ask our speakers, what are, in your own opinions, the grand challenges within the individual approaches that each of you addressed in moving this technology forward? And maybe if we start with reverse order, we'll start with James and move towards me.
Well, I think I alluded to it in my presentation, but, and of course you're very familiar with this, but I think coupling all of these chemical processes needed to produce solar fuels, directly coupling all of the chemistry required, multi-electron chemistry, as we call it, with single photon light absorption, but also kind of the scale of the problem, nano to macro. So that I would say that the coupling of the various disparate chemical pieces together needed to produce the fuel.
So I think I talked about it as well in the beginning of my talk. Like I said, nature has gotten really good at generating energy for itself, or for an organism to generate energy for itself. And just in the last several decades, we've had this idea, we're going to use these processes to generate energy for us. So I think the big challenge is first to figure out how we're going to do that and do it cheaply and cost competitively with fossil fuels and engineer that. And secondly is to kind of survey all of the available possibilities in bioenergy production, which there are way more than we've even begun to think about looking at yet, and make sure that we've covered our bases there. So more of a high throughput approach to bioenergy.
For energy storage, I think probably the major challenge is an economic one. It's designing materials, or at least developing materials that are better but still are less expensive, or at least as expensive as current materials. Because you could essentially just make any, you could come up with something very exotic using exotic elements, but eventually if they're rare elements, it's going to be expensive, and then there's really no point in actually applying it to anything. So once you find those materials, though, the next challenge is actually making them into something that works appropriately. And that's done using a variety of, say, synthesis methods. And then beyond that, you really have to use engineering in order to put it together in a package where it's actually going to be something that's useful, and safe. And safety is a big issue, at least for energy storage, portable energy storage, that is.
All right, thank you. It seems that most of you addressed science issues as ones being the grand challenges, but presumably there's also policy issues. And could you share with us some policy issues?
So for biofuels in large, not all bioenergy, but for biofuels, we talk about even algae, which don't directly compete with food crops. They're likely to require some sort of fertilizer, and they're definitely going to require water. So I think there are some ethical and policy concerns with biofuel production and competing with food crops and driving up food prices and land use challenges. So I think in terms of policy and ethical concerns, that's the biggest there.
So for energy storage and for portable batteries, at least, as I said, the thrust is really on the consumer side rather than the policy side. But policy would come into play in, say, funding of these sorts of projects. I know that the Department of Energy has a big initiative to develop batteries for vehicles that are up to certain standards. But they're not only funding academic research, they're funding commercial research. So it really has to do, I mean, in that sense, policy is important, and then I guess policy would also be important in terms of, say, using the natural resources that it takes to get the materials. That is not strip mining in order to get certain rare materials, not disposing of hazardous lithium in improper ways. But beyond that, it's not that big of a policy issue, I don't think.
So I think I'll take short-term and long-term policy issues. As a scientist, you hear this a lot in the community, and it becomes readily apparent after working in a laboratory setting that really what we need in terms of development of, better chemistry and, solar fuels technology is not bursts of funding, but sustained, solid support in terms of grants and the sort of the direction of those grants towards the goals. These problems cannot be solved quickly is what I would say. And what we need is collaborative effort sustained over the year timescale, not the decade timescale, not the political cycle. But then, longer term, once we have the support to develop the technology, I would say that what we need is, in terms of policy, is just constant debate and discussion about how to move from the existing energy system, which is so reliant on carbon, to a new energy system. And of course, I'd like to think that one day we will be absolutely carbon neutral and on solar fuels, but I know that it's going to take decades to get there.
Okay, well, I realize I missed something. So probably a lot of you listened to the State of the Union, and there's a big initiative to increase the number of electric vehicles on the road by 2020. Yeah, so my editorial on that is that it's not actually possible without somebody wanting to buy those cars. So you can put in all of the funding that you want, but you won't necessarily get to the point where you're increasing the use of that technology in accordance with whatever the policy decisions are. So yeah.
So I have a number of questions I can keep asking, but I'll open it up to the floor to take some questions and maybe interject from time to time. Are there questions in the audience for our speakers?
Harold Day, pharmacist. How do you recognize, how do you reconcile going from carbon to inorganic energy sources with our ability to go to space, and with space being so disruptive? Since space is primarily, the things in space are primarily inorganic, how would you foresee the progress from going from a carbon to an inorganic source like hydrogen?
So I should say, I assume this is a solar fuels issue. So I guess I sidestepped the issue during my talk, but the simplest case in terms of thinking about an electrochemical cell is to think about splitting water, as they say, into oxygen and using the hydrogen directly as a fuel. But there are other possible schemes where carbon in some form is incorporated into a reduced fuel using the electrons and protons that come from water. So I think it's totally possible and likely that technology will be developed which takes some sort of a carbon feedstock, be it CO2 or something else, which is then reduced into fuel in the manner that we think of it today, which of course solves a lot of problems because hydrogen is a very light, flammable, diffuse gas, whereas gasoline is a nice, compact liquid which can be easily pumped into your gas tank. There are many approaches, and I think that traditional carbon-based fuels that we make ourselves shouldn't be discounted.
Like in Texas, you have big interest in the windmills. Is there an ethical lean to alternative energy so that one is favored over the other for a better ethical reason, such as windmills are favored over hydrogen or
I think the issue there is hydrogen, I guess, would be more of a storage form, whereas wind is a capture and conversion technology. So you're capturing wind energy, but you still have these same storage issues with, for example, your question of wind versus hydrogen.
And one thing that I hope came across during my presentation, at least, is that when we talk about renewable energy, it seems more and more that what we talk about is a bookshelf or a small set or a growing set of distinct and different solutions, which at least for the short term sort of form a family of related technologies that are growing and form sort of a suite of solutions to the energy problem. Which one wins seems less important.
In terms of implementation, we heard that it will take years, decades maybe, to implement either of these technologies. Is there one technology that will be favored over others or is more likely to quicker succeed and be implemented? Do you have any ideas on that?
No.
The typical answer by scientists is the one I'm working on.
And we're all scientists, so watch out.
So for biofuels, there's lots of, for bioenergy, there's lots of competing options. So for example, anaerobic digestion is commonly used all over the country right now. Maybe it's not optimized, but it's used. And then there's things like algae biofuels and other types of biofuels that we might use that aren't really used right now, but could be used pretty quickly because we're making a substance, if you make biodiesel, that we can put into a truck's gas tank right now. So that timeline could be quick, but it probably won't be. And then there's other further off ideas in bioenergy that are probably on the decade time scale. So it's a very broad area for that specific, for bioenergy, that goes from in use today to decades off.
For energy storage, I think probably there's no one or the other. There's it's not there are no alternatives. There's just optimization. So essentially, you start with something and then you find something that's slightly better, and you run with it. So that's been kind of the course of how secondary batteries have been developed over the years, and I mean, this is where some of the research is going. First to easy things, like lithium sulfur from just typical lithium ion, or and then eventually to harder things like lithium air, and you know, potentially coupling batteries to fuel cells. Saw a recent paper which is actually quite interesting that couples the idea of lithium air with fuel cell, and actually, I mean, it's very complicated and would require quite a lot of engineering to actually make something that's usable. But if it was gotten to the point where it could work in commercially anyway, then I think it would probably become the new standard.
So in the area of solar fuels and hydrogen, what I would say is that the technology exists to produce hydrogen with a photovoltaic, at least, and then to put that hydrogen into a bottle, and to put the hydrogen in that bottle into a fuel cell car. The problem, of course, is that it's extremely expensive. Hydrogen produced by water electrolysis, in a study from the early 2000s, in England at least, was that hydrogen produced from electrolysis of water is 4 times as expensive as hydrogen produced by other means from fossil fuel. But they're encouraging developments. I'm sure Rob Friedlander will share that Proton Energy and a related company, Sun Hydro, have an initiative to create an East Coast hydrogen highway. The first station or fueling station on that highway is now open in Wallingford, and it uses Proton Energy's water electrolysis technology to produce hydrogen for a small fleet of, I believe, Toyota or GM fuel cell cars. So I think we're seeing a lot of development But as I said, I think we need sustained interest and policy support.
Question. So for the two gentlemen on the side, probably more than the storage. In the work that you're doing, how do you foresee scalability to commercial levels?
Well, I guess I can start. So in the work that I personally do, I study one of the catalytic transformations, and that's the transformation of water into oxygen. And I don't use light directly in my own work to accomplish that transformation. I use electricity. So I essentially study water electrolysis. And the catalyst that I use for that reaction is iridium. And iridium is among the least abundant metals on the planet. It's a noble metal, a transition metal. So I don't think that any of us will have an iridium-based water electrolyzer in our basements anytime soon. But I do think that studying such non-commercializable or less commercializable systems is still of interest, and I think we're still learning a lot. There's a lot of work going on now to search for catalysts that are based on abundant metals, and I think that, well, I know that based on work that's come out just in the past 2 or 3 years since I've been a graduate student, that we can expect great things.
Are there other stations other than Wallingford that are on that highway?
I don't think they're open yet.
No, I mean plant.
Oh yes.
Are they plant?
Yeah, I think 7 to 10.
So, the policy issue and production and the long-term use of these technologies, they already been, somehow talk about the environment, but a little bit more direct is the development of this technology. And also this technology, as it has been said, we're going to use more newer technology as it's available, right? So some technology is going to become obsolete, right? So I would like to know the environmental impact in the development of this technology, and also the environmental impact of the obsolete technology that is no longer useful.
Mm-hmm.
I guess I can kind of address that because, okay. Well, as you know, it's difficult to dispose of batteries in general, especially like primary ones and ones that involve, acids and toxic things. So right now, you can't really get rid of them. You can take them apart, and it has to be done in a very controlled environment. And if you were to dispose of, say, lithium cells, you'd have to do it in a very careful way where it's safe. And actually, it probably would be quite expensive. And that's actually something that I think has been factored into the development of some of these new electric cars. That the batteries in them are only supposed to last about about 10 years, I think, something like, or 8 to 10 years. And then what are they going to do after? I think many of the companies, especially GM, which has the new Volt, and Tesla, are going to be taking those batteries back in and will be disassembling them and reusing whatever lithium is left and the materials left over, and put it in recycling them, assuming that all that material is still usable in the next generation, which if it isn't, there's a huge loss there. And somehow, if you don't use it again, it has to be disposed of, and that's going to be costly no matter what.
I think it's a serious area we can learn from nature. And nature moves large amounts of energy. So we said 120,000 terawatts of sunlight earlier, and 30 terawatts of that is we would need as we move to the future. Nature, in the process of photosynthesis, does close to 90 terawatts of turnover. And the way it does this with avoiding the generation of waste is cycles. And you want to do things in cycles. You want to have things where your end product is your starting material. And this is one of the promising areas of the solar fuels, is that you're using water, you're splitting that water, and then your fuel is bringing it back together to make water. And so it's a closed cycle. But this is a serious issue of innovation. Every innovator has to look behind them, and we have this huge pile of trash behind us, that we've left in our wake.
So I'd like to add one thing. So everyone's car that runs on gasoline at least has a catalytic converter in it. And in that catalytic converter, there's precious metal rhodium. And rhodium is one of the most expensive elements. It's a transition metal. But it's recycled from all those catalytic converters and reused. Likewise, in proton exchange membrane water electrolyzers, there are precious metal catalysts inside. And luckily, first of all, it's not the catalyst that dies in that device. It's the plastic fittings that connect everything together and the proton exchange membrane itself. But when the catalyst and the assembly does go in for refurbishing, the precious metals can be recycled and reused from within that membrane. So if we do deploy a fleet of these electrolysis cells with precious metals, there's some possibility for recycling in that regard.
Maybe we get one last question and final statements.
So hydrogen and batteries are both very relevant to transportation. I was wondering if you, like your path, converting sunlight into hydrogen, using that in a fuel cell in a car, versus converting sunlight into electricity, using photovoltaics, storing it in a battery, and then fueling a car, using that to propel a car. What are the sun-to-wheel efficiencies of both paths, and will the winner stay the winner, or will it flip?
It's the efficiency of yours.
What?
It's the efficiency.
Well, Gary, I think
Please.
you. I don't know the absolute efficiency off the top of my head. I know that there are serious limitations, both in terms of if we assume that the light absorbing efficiency is going to be the same for the photovoltaics in each case, and we can throw that out as the same limitation for each.
Yeah, it's a tricky question, efficiency, and it depends how you define it. Okay, so if we define it as total energy in versus total energy out, photosynthetic organisms, biological organisms, are rather inefficient. They operate at efficiencies less than 5%. So if we look at current photovoltaics that I could go in the store and buy today, they operate at a energy conversion efficiency of roughly 15 to 20%. Now, mind you, the solar electric has done now solar to electricity, whereas photosynthesis has done solar to fuel. When you have something you can burn, at the end of the day, it's stored. But on top of that, as James pointed out in his talk, you can buy commercial water electrolyzers, and these operate at very high efficiency, 75 to 80% efficiency. So in many ways, technology already outcompetes biology in terms of just efficiency. And I think where the real problem comes in, though, is one of cost. Nature does these at relatively low cost, using earth-abundant materials that operate at room temperature and then under very mild conditions. And so I think this is a strategy that humans can learn from, and pushing our innovations and technology forward is to bring the cost down.
I realize that I guess the difference is that there's one more step for making a solar fuel. Is you still have to use the fuel, and then there's a loss of efficiency there. But I mean, there will be beyond just making the electricity and then storing it, it has to be transferred somewhere, and that has to be through some sort of wires. And again, there are losses there, which may or may not be as large. I don't know exactly, but if you just go by the steps and the losses at each step, I guess I shouldn't probably say anything, not knowing the numbers, but I'm biased, so.
Yeah, and correct me if I'm wrong, my understanding is that in the battery technology, the push for technology really has been in improving energy densities and power densities, which are subtly different. And from your chart we saw today, historically, the battery technology may be somewhere around 0.5 kilograms, or I'm sorry, megawatts per kilogram. But some of these lithium-air battery technologies showed today really are pushing upwards towards fuels, which are around 50 megawatts per kilogram for liquid fuels. Hydrogen a little bit higher, maybe 150 closer to. So I think it's a different questions to address for different capture and conversion versus storage.
All right, everybody. I think we reached the end of our time for today. But there will be a continuation which will happen next Wednesday, the 30th at Kroon Hall, where actually the advisors of these beautiful and wise folks will speak as well and further continue to talk about the technology addressed. That is going to be also at 6 p.m. and it's going to end around 7:30. So for now, let's thank our speakers one more time.